The book of Leviticus. It's the third book of the Bible, and it's set right after the exodus of the Israelites from their slavery, when God brought them to the foot of Mount Sinai and invited Israel into a covenant relationship. Now, they had quickly rebelled and broke that covenant, and God had wanted for his glorious presence to come and live right in the midst of Israel in the form of this tabernacle. But Israel's sin has damaged the relationship. So, at the end of the previous book, Exodus, Moses, as Israel's representative, could not even enter God's presence in the tent. The book of Leviticus opens by reminding us of this fundamental problem. It says, "The Lord called to Moses from the tent." So the question is, how can Israel, in their sin and selfishness, be reconciled to this holy God? That's what this book is all about, how God is graciously providing a way for sinful, corrupt people to live in his holy presence. Now, let's pause for a second and explore this really important idea that God is holy. It's fundamental to understanding this book. The word holy means simply to be set apart or unique. And in the Bible, God is set apart from all other things because of his unique role as the creator of all, as the author of life itself. And so if God is holy, then the space around God is also holy. It's full of his goodness and his life and purity and justice. So if Israel, who is unjust and sinful, wants to live in God's holy presence, they too need to become holy. Their sin has to be dealt with. Thus, the book of Leviticus. Now, the book has a really amazing symmetrical design. It explores the three main ways that God helps Israel to live in his presence. The outer sections are descriptions of the rituals Israel was to practice in God's holy presence. The next inner sections focus on the role of Israel's priests as mediators between God and Israel. And inside of that are two matching sections that focus on Israel's purity. And then right here at the center of the book, there's a key ritual, the Day of Atonement, that brings the whole book together. The book concludes with a short section where Moses calls on Israel to be faithful to this covenant. Let's dive into the book. The first section explores the 5 main types of ritual sacrifices that Israel was to perform. 2 of these were ways that an Israelite could say thank you to God by offering back to God these symbolic tokens of what God has first given them. 3 other sacrifices were different ways of saying sorry to God. So here an Israelite would offer up the lifeblood of an animal while confessing that their sin has created more evil and death in God's good world. But instead of destroying this person, God, of course, wants to forgive them. And so this animal symbolically dies in their place and atones, which means it covers for their sin. And so through these rituals, the Israelites were constantly being reminded of God's grace, but also of his justice and of the seriousness of their evil and its consequences. The second set of rituals lays out the 7 annual feasts of Israel. And each of these retold a different part of the story about how God redeemed them from slavery in Egypt and brought them through the wilderness on their way to the Promised Land. And by celebrating these feasts regularly, Israel would remember who they were and who God was to them.
Right, we're going to look at the book of Leviticus, which I'm sure you know and love so well. A fellow called J. Sklar wrote a very interesting commentary in Leviticus that I read through. And he says this: even if we can agree intellectually that Leviticus, as part of God's inspired word, must be very important, few of us feel that to be true. Indeed, when I tell people that I've spent years studying Leviticus, many respond with the type of smile that says, oh well, at least he's not hurting anybody. Hands up for those of you, just a straw poll, hands up if you've read through the entire book of Leviticus. Right, I would say that's between a third and a half, right? Okay. I wonder why. And I think he gives the reason. He says these words: Leviticus seems very disconnected from our world today. Most of us see no practical need to know about things like sacrifice, priests, purity, and so on. These are simply not the realities we deal with on a daily basis. And that is perfectly true. You could ask me the question, can I be a Christian and never read Leviticus? Well, of course you can. But if someone that you love deeply wrote a letter to you, and that letter had quite a bit of detail at the start, and you said, well, I'm getting lost here. I'm going to ignore that bit, but I'll just concentrate on the bit that talks about, how nice and much they love me, then that would be a very partial understanding of what your lover was trying to share with you. And the Bible is a love book that God shares not just for us, because we're not the only ones it was written to, but for the whole world, and of course for the Jews. And he points out that it would be a tragic mistake to overlook the book of Leviticus, because, and this is the key thing, Leviticus is the first time where any book or anything describes a point in human history when the God who gives us meaning came and dwelt in the midst of his people. And when Jesus came, it says that he was God dwelling in the midst of his people. In John 1:12, it says that Jesus came and lived amongst us. And the word that is used in the New Testament is that Jesus came and tabernacled amongst us. Do you get it? Now, if you haven't heard of the tabernacle and haven't read some of these bits, you will miss so many dimensions of what God was really doing. So it is quite important. I think the second thing to say at this point, too, is that the context is very important. Because you've got to remember this. Moses went up Mount Sinai, and the Israelites were parked around Mount Sinai. They spent over a year and a bit parked around that mountain while God explained to Moses who he is, and the Israelites didn't know. That all sorts of funny names for God. What he's like, they didn't know what he was like. What he commands, the Ten Commandments, and many others, and how he is to be worshipped. And the way he said he was to be worshipped to the Jews was through the tabernacle and some of the things that we've been looking at a few minutes ago. But it is what lay behind that was so important. And you've got to remember that people didn't know who he was. They hadn't a Bible. They couldn't look it up and check for themselves. So let's move on and let's take a look through what the story of Leviticus is about. As that video, and I will be coming back. We're going to actually split the video into three, or actually there's about 5 bits. We'll be coming back to various clips within it to help illustrate, because it does demand a bit more. But the first start, of course, are the rituals, the sacrifices. And there's 3 holy things in the book of Leviticus, and it's split up accordingly. And there's the chapter numbers, if you need to follow it through. The holy sacrifices, they're laid out. Then there's the holy priests that had to become as mediators to God, and it explains what their job was and how they were to behave. And then thirdly, the book also writes about the people themselves. They were to become pure, a holy people. And that's just as true for us believers today as it was for them. They were to be clean before God. And that's something we often overlook too often. And the key phrase in the book of Leviticus is up there. Be holy, because I, the Lord, I am holy. We've got to be like him. Often we say, I like to become like Jesus. Jesus is holy. The book of Leviticus uses the word holy 56 times. That is far more than any other book in the Bible. Even the Psalms are well short of that, because God is giving us a message as he was giving the Jews. So it's very important that we follow this. What does it mean to be holy? Too often in our Christian circles today, we think Jesus is my bestie, my best friend, and give me a high five, Jesus. I remember when I was just converted, and a fella from a big evangelist from America came, and he walked around. He carried this cross on his back with a wheel at the end of it. That's cheating, I thought. Anyhow, he would wander around with this cross, and he would get a crowd together and say, "Give me a J, J. Give me a E." Funny way of saying it. E. Well, you can see where it's going. So we spelled out the name of Jesus as if he's a great guy. He's like a president or a big hero. And we have grown up with that sort of comfort factor that I can put Jesus around my ankles or wrists or whatever, and that he's my bestie friend. You have no idea who he is if you think that's who he is. He is the God of creation. And this video elsewhere goes on to point out, what does it mean to be holy? Well, he compares it to the sun. The sun is pure light, burning. and that it gives us warmth, it gives us growth, it gives us everything we could ask for. If the sun were to disappear, the world would be extinguished. But yet the sun, in all its beauty and glory that we need, if you get too close to it, will burn you up. And too often we think we can bounce into Jesus' presence and God, and that's it, and here we are. We forget, no, he is awesome. And when the Israelites gathered around Sinai, they stared and they saw the rumblings and they said, no, 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 Moses, you go up, but don't let us come and suffer the fire and the pain of what we're like, because we know what our sinful hearts are like. So there's much that we can learn, and sometimes we rush in where angels fear to tread. So there we've got the outline of the book. The first bit that was explained there were the sacrifices. And the first 7 chapters explain the sacrifices. It's not the easiest reading in the world. I do admit that. And then, of course, the last few chapters in 23, chapter 27, explain when the festival days, in addition to the daily sacrifices, the Israelites had to come and give thanksgiving. But if you look, you'll see the list there. There are 3 big sacrifices that I'm just going to very briefly explain. Number 1, the Jews and the Israelites, when they approached God, the first thing they had to present to God was an animal, obviously, and a sacrifice, and it was called the sin offering. It starts that if I approach God, I can't ignore the fact I'm a sinner. So the person who was the penitent would put their hands on the head of the animal, they would confess their sins, and as it were, place their sin on the animal, and the animal would then be taken by the priest, it would be killed, and then offered to God as a satisfaction for sin. The word we use in the theology is propitiation. That is, it is accepted by God, and it deals with our sin. And so that was important. But then that was followed by a second sacrifice. Now, the way they offered the sin offering is that the priest got part of the meat of that sacrifice to one side, so that the priest was identifying with the sinner and saying, I too am a human, but I am representing God, and therefore you will have your sin forgiven. But the burnt offering that it describes was different. Again, they confessed their sins, but on this occasion, they brought the burnt offering and saying, I am offering this. And what I'm asking the priest to do is not just kill it and put its blood around, but nobody's going to touch it. They will carve it up, and they will burn the whole of this sacrifice on the altar. And the word in Hebrew is the word holocaust. I wonder where that word comes from. A whole burnt offering. And that is how my life should be to God. And that's what they were saying. Is that the way we approach our lives? I'm holding nothing back, not just a smidgen. I'm offering it all on the altar. And that was important for them too. And then thirdly, the other one that is important is the fellowship offering. Now this was different. They offered it, but then they shared the meat out, and the family would eat the meat together, as would the priest. And so we get I hope you've got the idea. I have to acknowledge my sin. I offer my entire life to God, and through that, God allows me to have fellowship and share with him. Now, of course, I don't need to tell you that Jesus, of course, encompassed all this for us, but that was what they had to go through, and that was important. And then the festival days, they could give the other thanksgiving offerings. So the approach to God was that sin was atoned, and that word comes a lot in the book of Romans. The Holocaust, that is the burnt offering, and the fellowship offerings would allow us to have thanksgiving and sharing and fellowship. And then the assurance that the priests could give was that they're forgiven for those sins, and service could then follow. And this culminates in the Day of Atonement, which I think, Mike, have we got that one separate? Yep, okay. So we'll show you another one on the Day of Atonement, which was the one day in the year in October when the high priest was allowed to come inside the most holy place around here. And that was a special one. But just before we're going to watch that, just to remind us, the rituals that they went through were so important, but they all fell short of what Jesus offers. So let's have a look at that video, that short clip on the Day of Atonement.
Now, here at the center of the book, we find a long description of one of Israel's annual feasts, the Day of Atonement. Odds are that not every Israelite's sin and rebellion would be covered through the individual sacrifices. And so once a year, the high priest would take 2 goats. One of these would become a purification offering and atone for the sins of the people. And the other was called the scapegoat. The priest would confess the sins of Israel and symbolically place them on this goat, and then it would be cast out into the wilderness. Again, this is a very powerful image of God's desire to remove sin and its consequences from his people so that God can live with them in peace.
So how do we apply this? The New Testament, if you look at the book of Hebrews, it makes quite clear that all these sacrifices were a picture, an image, but they couldn't give the Israelites full assurance of faith. They couldn't give them anything. In fact, it said here that the sacrifice, the law is only a shadow. It can never, by the same sacrifices repeated endlessly year after year, make perfect those who draw near to worship. What's it saying? Well, I've sinned today, and I bring it, and I take it in, present my lamb. Guess what I'm going to do next week? I'm going to have to come and present another lamb. And then the next week after that, and then that big festival, I'm going to have 3 lambs. In other words, they could never be sure, because it was short-lived. It was temporary. And then it says the worshippers would have been cleansed once for all and would have no longer felt guilty for their sins. But those sacrifices are an annual reminder, that's the scapegoat, of sin. And then Hebrews tells us in black and white, it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sin. Lovely old hymn that sometimes when I serve communion, I share one of its verses. Not all the blood of beasts on Jewish altars slain can give the guilty conscience peace, nor take away the stain. But Christ, the heavenly Lamb, bears all my sins away, a sacrifice of nobler name and richer blood than they. These sacrifices were just reminding the Jews there was someone coming who would take it all. And so it tells us here, again, further in Hebrews 10, that when Christ came, he said, sacrifice and offering you did not desire. Those sacrifices the Jews were, they're not going to satisfy the true wrath of God, but a body you have prepared for me. Jesus was in that body, and the burnt offerings and sin offerings wouldn't take it, but he says, here am I. It's written about me. I have come to do your will, my God. And by that will, it says, we have been made holy through the sacrifice of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. I think they're the most 3 important verses in the entire Bible. That all these things the Jews had to do were fulfilled once on the cross, where Jesus gave his heart and life, and where he offered himself up to God and said, I am that burnt offering, accept me. I am the sin offering, take me for their sin. And that is the glory that we can do once for all. You don't have to keep coming back. You just meet Jesus, experience him in your life, and you know he's there forever. We're going to move on to look at the second part, and I'm going to invite Mike to put the video or get it ready for putting on. But before you go, I'm just going to illustrate one thing is, priests were brought in, and priests were called to be particularly holy. And they were mediators, before God with them. And I'll look at that term. In fact, we'll show the video now if we can, and we'll look at what their role was and why it's important that
Now, the sections about Israel's priests, you have Aaron and his sons first ordained to enter into God's presence on behalf of Israel. And then in this matching section, we find the qualifications for being a priest. The priests were called to the highest level of moral integrity and ritual holiness because they represented the people before God, but then also represented God to the people. Now, we find out why the priest's holiness matters so much back here in this first section. Right after the family of Aaron was ordained, 2 of his sons waltz right into God's presence and flagrantly violate the rules. And so they are consumed by God's holiness on the spot. It's a haunting reminder of the paradox of living in God's holy presence, because it's pure goodness, but it becomes dangerous to those who rebel and insult God's holiness. And so it's important that Israel's priests become holy, and also that all of the people of Israel become holy, which is what the next intersections are all about.
What is a mediator? A priest was one who was called to be a mediator between God and humankind. Can you remember when you first fancied somebody, and you said, I rather fancy her. Yeah, and she was thinking, he seems to have his eye on me, but I'm not too sure. What would you do? You would go and say, you're her best friend. I rather like her. Do you think you could have a little word in her ear, maybe to sort of explain that I've got a slight interest in her? No, maybe more than a slight interest in her. And could you give her this box of chocolates as well? Something like that. And so they would go there, and then they would say, he's interested in you? Oh, I'm not too sure. I'll go on. What do you think? Maybe. Would you tell him that I might be interested? That person in the middle is the go-between. And that is what a priest is. When that person goes to her friend, she's representing the boy, trying to explain to her, this is what he wants to say to you, but he's too shy to really come up and say it. And when she goes back to the boy, she's saying, well, she's a bit too shy to come and tell you herself, but I'm going to explain to you. The go-between, the mediator, the one in the middle. And that is exactly what God did, created priests. Who would be that? And as it describes here, that they are on the Godward side of mankind, and they're on the manward side of God. Let me explain what do we mean by that. I think it's explained better in the film. That when a priest spoke or came to the people, he was presenting what God had said to him to the people. But when he came into the holy place, he was presenting to God what the people had done and said and praying for them. A mediator. And that is what the priests were called to be, because God chose just the Levite tribe, and from that, just the family of Aaron, who were allowed to go into this holy place and do those things, who had to be especially holy. Their rules and regulations were much tighter about the behavior they could have, as we'll see in a few minutes. And the whole point of this, of the priesthood, is that every detail of their life was carefully controlled by God. And they had no inheritance, but only they could approach God in the temple. They didn't get loads of land like Judah and Benjamin. They were spread out across the whole of Israel so that people could access them and therefore could get access to God. And these subject to these conditions of holiness and behavior. And we apply this to the same measure that we applied for the sacrifices. That every day the priest would keep doing these sacrifices, and it says they can never take away the sins. The people had to continually go back and forward through this mediator. They did not have direct access to God. They couldn't pray and talk direct to God in the same way that you and I can. They had to ensure that the priest was part of the deal. And so this, again, contrasts so much about Jesus, that when this priest, that's Jesus, had offered for all time one sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God, for by one sacrifice he has made perfect forever those who are being made holy. Jesus is our high priest, who once he had sacrificed, gave access direct to God through himself. He is the perfect priest, and the one that gives true access. And so Paul was able to write later that there is one God and one mediator between God and mankind, the man Christ Jesus, who gave himself as a ransom for all people. Now, some of you may have grown up in the Catholic Church, or an Anglican church, like I did. And some of you may think priests are the people we've got to go to, who've got to do Mass and all the other things, and they kind of stand between us and God. The whole point is that when Jesus came, he destroyed that. The relationship is not through another individual, man, woman, or whatever. The relationship is direct with Jesus. And when you meet Jesus, you meet God. And that is the beauty of the New Testament. And remember, the Old Testament, the people had to follow these rules because God was going to do something bigger with the Messiah, but they didn't quite get it. So I hope that helps. But the one God and one mediator is Jesus, who we can know and can be personal with and can have in our hearts and lives. That leads us on to the next one. So I'm going to invite the team to put the video up on the whole purity laws. And
Chapters 11 through 15 are about the ritual purity required of all the Israelites, and chapters 18 through 20 are about the moral purity of the people. Here's what's underneath all of this purity and impurity language. Because God is holy and he's set apart, the Israelites need to be in a state of holiness themselves when they enter into his presence. This was called being clean or pure. God's presence was off limits to anybody who was not in a holy state, and this was called being unclean or impure. Now, an Israelite could become impure in just a few ways. By contact with reproductive body fluids, by having a skin disease, by touching mold or fungus, or by touching a dead body. Now, for the Israelites, all of these were associated with mortality, with the loss of life, which gets us to the core symbol of all these ideas. You become impure when you're contaminated by touching death, so to speak. And death is the opposite of God's holiness because God's essence is life. Now, this is really key. Simply being impure was not sinful or wrong. Touching these kinds of things was a normal part of everyday life. And impurity was a temporary state. It just lasted a week or two, and then it's over. What was wrong or sinful was to waltz into God's presence carrying these symbols of death and impurity on my body. Don't do that. Now, the last way of becoming impure was by eating certain animals, and the kosher food laws are found right here in this section. Now, there have been lots of theories about why certain animals were considered impure and off limits. To promote hygiene or to avoid cultural taboos, the text just isn't explicit. But the basic point of all of these chapters is really clear. Altogether, these work as an elaborate set of cultural symbols that reminds Israel that God's holiness was to affect all areas of their lives. This corresponding section over here is about Israel's moral purity. The Israelites were called to live differently than the Canaanites. They were to care for the poor instead of overlooking them. They were to have a high level of sexual integrity, and they were to promote justice throughout their entire land.
So, the peculiar food laws and things might puzzle us at times. And the key thing to a lot of this is that every aspect and every detail of the Jewish life was regulated by these rules in order that the behavior that God expects might come out. And the two types were the ceremonial ones, which he's mentioned, which you could become ceremonially unclean just by touching a dead body or whatever. If you kicked over a dead dog, that was it, you were unclean. And the parable of the Good Samaritan, you well know the story that the priest and the Levite kept well clear because they didn't want to be contaminated. And it was ceremonial. But there was also, of course, a moral purity. And the two groups that it gives in the book of Leviticus, some are to do with moral things, such as the way that you marry and laws against stealing, murder, and all that sort of thing, expanded, and others are in a lot of detail in ceremonies. But the key thing that brings together is that every aspect of the Jewish life was regulated. Your family, who you could marry, the food you would eat, how and when you could have sex, dress, what way you dressed, and how your hair, even if you're a priest, particularly how your hair was tended. Absolutely every aspect of your worship, your cleanliness, including there was actually a reference to how you could go to the toilet in the book of Leviticus. There are all sorts of things that were in there in great detail. Why? The answer is quite simple. The New Testament. God controls every aspect of your life. And the Israelites had to discover that the hard way by learning what they could do and what they couldn't do. But we have a better way of doing so, and that is through, of course, the presence of the Holy Spirit within us, but also God's Word, which they didn't have, that we can read and reflect on. Now, the key thing is that the regulations of food and quarantine had some very peculiar ways of getting around things. The fact was that if you were impure by touching a dead body, there was a way you could become pure, and therefore there was an approach you could take. And one of the good examples was leprosy or skin diseases. And I'm just going to give you an illustration of how this worked, so that the Israelites could pick up something that we in the New Testament know a few things about. But I'll show you how it works. If you had leprosy or some of those skin diseases, you would then be sent outside the camp, and you'd have to stay there until that leprosy was healed. But then, once it was healed, you would have to show yourself to the priest to prove it was done. And indeed, Jesus met a young man who was a leper, and he threw himself on the ground and said, "Lord, make me clean." And Jesus then said to him, after he healed him, "Go and show yourself to the priest as a witness to them," the priest. The man disobeyed. Naughty, naughty. But what was he supposed to do? I'll show you what he was supposed to do. Briefly, I'm going to have an animal sacrifice here, so as you do. And so what they had to do is that there were three things the person who was healed had to do. He had to go to a priest and have a sacrifice and present 2 doves. I think it's better that I don't kill 2 doves in front of you today. So I'm going to just use these little bits of paper as a representation. I hope you, if you would prefer the doves, I'll try. But anyhow, these are the little doves flapping around. The priest gets the doves, and what he does is he gets a bowl or a jar, and it's over running water, and he throws a few things in there that'll not bother you with. But anyhow, he does then, he sacrifices the animal, and he kills it, and its blood runs out, as you see, and so he's just killed the animal, and then he puts that and the blood into the bottom of the basin, and then he gets the other one, and he then takes this one out, and so is he going to kill this one? No. He's going to put that in, and he's going to place that into there, and mess it around a little bit, and then he's going to lift the living one out, and he's going to let go of it. He's going to let it fly away. What is that a picture of? Can you guess? Well, obviously you have to use 2 to make it work, because if you kill one, it's very hard to bring it back to life. But this is a picture of the resurrection. One dies and is placed in the cold stone tomb. The water indicates that the sins are washed away. But 3 days later, rises again and flies away. It's a bit like the scapegoat, you see. That this is a picture that there is a sacrifice that can be done that can take away your sin and wash it, just as that leprosy has been washed away. And that involves risen new life. So what had the man to do, or the woman to do, after healed from leprosy? 2 things. One was they had to wash themselves thoroughly with water, and so that again illustrates the cleansing. And then the third thing they had to do was to shave every hair off their body, the whole lot. You say, well, why would you want to do a silly thing like that? Well, they had to get a new start. And at what stage in a person's life do they have no hair on their body? Well, most people have no hair on their body. When they're born. And Jesus said, you must be born again. This simple leprosy thing actually brings together the sacrifice for sin of Jesus, the washing away from sin, and the new life in resurrection life that we are called to. A little picture. But all these tiny little sacrifices were deliberately embedded so that one day we believers might get the hang of it and understand what it means for us. So that's something then. And then, of course, the social behavior, as we mentioned, is there. So that's as much as I think I can cover. If I find my glasses and get on to the conclusion. Moses, what was his contribution? What was his legacy? Here we are at the end. Well, first, Moses was the great lawmaker. In fact, Moses learned the teaching of the Egyptians to read and write. And so Moses wrote everything down. The first time we have a Bible. And that Bible was there so that they would learn. They then taught their children songs, how to remind the next generations of what God had done, and don't leave it to just this generation. And dear friends, we've got to do that today in Amesbury. Pass it on. And that's what Moses did. And it says here that anyone who rejected the law of Moses died without mercy. But how much more severe would it be if someone who has trampled the Son of God underfoot, what Jesus has done and what he has brought? Because it says they have insulted the Spirit of grace. Moses brought the law, Jesus brought grace. And it says that Moses was like a servant in God's house, but Jesus was the true Son. And Christ is the faithful Son of our God's house. We are his house. Therefore, be holy as I am holy. God is indeed holy. And how should we live? It says that we should set our hope on the grace. Grace is undeserved. It's free. But there is a price that we need to develop, a life of sacrifice, a burnt offering of ourselves in his service. We need to become obedient children, not behaving just like we would like, but rather not conforming. And says, don't let the world squeeze you into its own mold. And that's what holiness is about. Be holy because I am holy. I wonder how holy you think God really is if you saw him. And it is that degree of holiness he declares that we should follow, not just in the book of Leviticus, but here in Peter's letter. We need to follow, and we need to learn how these things apply and grow. Last clip, I think.
The book concludes with Moses calling Israel to be faithful to all of the terms of the covenant. And he describes the blessings of peace and abundance that will result if Israel obeys all of these laws. He also warns them that if they're unfaithful and dishonor God's holiness, it will result in disaster and ultimately exile from the land promised to Abraham. Now, if you want to see how Leviticus fits into the big storyline, it's helpful to look at the first sentence of the next book of the Bible, Numbers. It begins, "The Lord spoke to Moses in the tent." So we can see that Moses is now able to enter God's presence on behalf of Israel. The book of Leviticus, it worked. So despite Israel's failure, God has provided a way for their sin to be covered so that God can live with sinful people in peace. And that's what the book of Leviticus is all about.